So we're in our final week of a focus on poverty and the faithful response to it as Christians. We welcome Flynt back. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing him. I think we're all familiar with the illustrious Auburn professor. Next to him is seated Angie Jones, the Director of Development and Communications with the Chalmers Center. Y'all remember the second week we had Brian Fickert, who spoke to us, and I think everybody walked away from that pretty wowed by his very insightful and presentation, talking about how we might rethink more productively a sustainable approach to and transformational approach to fighting poverty. Look forward to hearing from him. Jim Wooten, in the middle, is the Director of Finance at IPC and Executive Director of the IPC Foundation. And I don't, one thing that I have also failed to make clear over this service as moderator is this wasn't my idea. I'd love to get credit for it, but Jim Wooten and Mike Fleener and several other people in the congregation got together in 2013 and started talking about this as a potential program. It's through the Highland Avenue Forum. The Focus on Faith Committee also had input in developing it. But if you don't know it, Jim is not only an important leader here at IPC, but in the charitable community in Birmingham, he is really a force to be reckoned with. He is someone who is really challenging the charitable establishment and nonprofit world to think more deliberately about what they give, how they give, and the results you get to that giving. And you rarely go anywhere where there are people gathered to do good, and you don't see Jim Wooten there. Okay, so we're happy to have you, Jim. Next to him is Angie Wright, and I had known Angie Wright's name as the pastor and founder of Beloved Community Church in Avondale. You recently suffered some damage in a tornado, both at your house and at your church. So, a Job figure here. But in preparation for this panel, I found out another thing to be very admiring of you about co-founder of Alabama Arise, one of the co-founders. If y'all don't know Alabama Arise, you have an assignment. Leave here and go sign up for their daily newsletter. They read the papers from all across the country and all across the state, compile relevant headlines. Now, for some of you who are of the more, it's social justice oriented, so, take that with whatever you feel like it. But if you want to look at today's, we're in the center of the discussion in this country right now. If you look at Alabama Arise's daily update today, almost every story is from around the country is focused on these issues, the issues of equality, the Great Society, where are we now, where are we going, and it makes incredible reading. So thank you so much for Alabama Rise. Alabama Rise is based in Montgomery, and they're kind of the state version of Great Birmingham Ministries. Birmingham Ministries here works locally to address social issues from a faithful perspective, and they're doing the same thing in Montgomery, and very important work. Roger McCullough is the director of the ABLE Network, a statewide business consortium that promotes hiring and advancement of people with disabilities. And he is also, please consult him and give him whatever flag jacket you have. He has recently been called on to be the interim administrator of Cooper Green Hospital. So he is in the thick of it. Without further ado, he's also been active working on hunger and poverty issues in Birmingham for years now. So we're going to ask each of the panelists to kind of open up with a statement reflecting on the faithful response to poverty and how we've been thinking over the last month about this issue, what they personally feel, and maybe highlighting something that they see as positive going on, a positive approach that holds promise. So, Dr. Flynt, would you like to start out, please?
I wrote down my comments. We was given 3 minutes, and I really won't stick to the 3 minutes because I want to have plenty of time for your input. And thank you so much to IPC for doing what I wish every congregation in Alabama would do, because it would change the narrative of this conversation statewide dramatically. The question that was posed to me was, you have an understanding of Alabama's history of the faith community in the state. What are some suggestions for a springboard to the future? What is a faithful response? There's an enormous amount of historical data that convinces me that Alabama Christian faith communities are more faithful to their cultures than to their founder. Therefore, I see no point in continuing useless conversations about issues where for 150 years we've not been able to reach a Christian consensus. Slavery, apartheid, the 1901 Constitution, regressive tax policy, marginalizing women, one of the nation's highest rates of poverty, one of the nation's highest rates of child poverty. After the state is about to celebrate its 200th birthday, and in a state which claims to be the buckle of the Bible belt, does not suggest that just preaching the gospel to the choir is going to move us very much forward on this issue. So, I begin to think that in some ways the epitaph for Alabama is going to come from T.S. Eliot. And wind shall say, here were decent, godless people, their only monument, the asphalt road and 1,000 lost golf balls. And I think we have a Trinity, but I don't think it's God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. I think it's materialism, hedonism, and narcissism. So how do you break through the reality of that religion and not the one that we think we have? And therefore, I would suggest that we're going to have to move the debate from the teachings of Jesus and the theology of the Christian church to issues of materialism and pragmatism which characterize our fellow citizens. For instance, Alabama is not a competitive state in a global-based world economy. As more fairly well-educated whites either retire or die or both, the workforce is going to have to either recruit a new population of whites who don't live here now to come into the state and do what that generation has done, or else it's going to have to educate its people of color to do the jobs which whites did in my generation. That is true because this is the last year in the history of American education in which the majority of the students K through 12 will be white. Next year, the majority will be people of color, and so it will escalate over the next 30 years. All schools are already predominantly people of color. In the South as a whole, Alabama will reach majority minority status in 2017 in its public schools. America will be a majority minority nation of color in 2042 at current demographic trends. So the truth of the matter is, it doesn't really make any difference how you feel about people of color. And it doesn't make any difference how you feel about raising your taxes in order to pay for better schools. The problem is, this state has no future unless we educate a labor force that we have neglected, discriminated against, and marginalized. Women, people of color, will be the workforce that will provide the new physicians for Obamacare, in the next generation, not the white doctors we're worried will retire early because they don't like Obamacare. It's going to be a new world of learning, and the question is not whether we will have that world. That world is already born. It's how we deal with that new world. Either we address the problems systemically, poverty, better schools, different tax structure, or else we drift into the eddies of a river rushing forward, where other people will be pushed down that current and we will be left out in the shadows of the eddies. Third, don't wait for others to lead or for solutions to the top. We're not going to get it. Our political leadership and culture has failed us for 150 years. Why would you think it's going to change in your lifetime? The truth of the matter is, people who are people of faith and who care about these issues are the ones who are going to have to change the narrative of debate. It's not going to come from them. Witness the political campaign currently that insults your intelligence at every single advertisement on TV. Finally, we must learn to network. It's so great to have so many groups: Greater Birmingham Ministries, Alabama Rise, Alabama Possible, Sowing Seeds of Hope. We don't need to be carbon copies of each other. We need to do what the Chinese proverb says, which is to let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. There are many ways to solve these problems, and every one of these groups has a way of solving this problem within the niche that they occupy. There are so many good networks already existing. What we need to do is strengthen, join, participate in all of those great networks. There's such a wide range of universities, faith communities, business leaders, educators, people of deep faith who are already networked into these groups, and especially because the universities now care so deeply about these issues. I think some really exciting things are going to happen. Some are doing great advocacy work like Alabama Rise, Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama, Impact Alabama, Bama Covered, Birmingham Community Ministries. Some are doing research and education. And what we need to do is simply link to, strengthen, mobilize, and empower those organizations to have a greater and greater influence and make sure that they represent this people across the state.
Right?
I'll go by Angie today. Well, thanks for having me here today to Jim and IPC. Just to connect with what Wayne was saying, we tend to think of everything in material terms. Our life is very materialistic for most of us, and that impacts the way we look at poverty. We think of poverty primarily in material terms. People who don't have things, that's what makes them poor. But when we look at it through that lens, we often miss the root issues, and those are just symptoms arising from the root. And so what I would say a part of a faithful response is to re-engineer the way we look at poverty, to look not that the material isn't real, the material issues are real when it comes to poverty, but maybe that's not the root issue. So just a few things as to what a faithful response would look like if we were to take a more relational and less material approach to poverty. I would say that first of all, our approach has to be dignity-driven to the poor and not deficiency-driven. We tend to look at poverty, at communities and individuals that are poor, and we see things they don't have. And all of our interactions are typically motivated by that and framed by that, what they don't have. That's a deficiency-driven approach. Whereas a dignity-driven approach would be to be mindful these people are made in the image of God. They've got things. They may not even know they have things, but we believe because God tells us that they're made in His image, that they have things. They have skills, abilities, they have dreams about their future. And that we need to embrace those and use those in the process. And so we want to have a dignity-driven approach. I would also say that we want to be, it's part of a faithful response would be to be non-paternalistic in our interactions with the poor. And by that we mean not doing for others what they're capable of doing for themselves. I think sometimes we do it because it makes us feel better because we've done something. nobody wants to say it, but among many of our circles, there is a poverty tourism industry where we can go places and do things for others. And when we do that, we paralyze people who are in those communities from doing for themselves. I talked to a businessman in Fort Worth who recently went down to Mexico to help build an orphanage with, I think, a church group. And he said he was sitting there pounding nails into walls in Mexico when he realized at every construction site he lives near in Texas it's made up of Mexican workers. that this was more about him doing things so that he could feel like he did something, rather than actually empowering the people there to do things that they're quite capable of doing. But then also connected to what Wayne said, part of the third thing I would say is part of faithful response is partnering with people who are already there. A lot of times the answer isn't to start something new, or maybe even for you to go do it yourself, but to find the people that are already connected to that community and to get behind them through your funding, through the volunteerism and other ways, to partner with people who are already there so that they can do their work better, they can go farther, faster than you ever could in that community. And I think, once again, just like when we look at an individual, we don't want to think of their deficiencies. We want to think of their dignity. When we look at poor neighborhoods and poor communities, we want to be reminded that God was there long before we showed up. He has been working in that neighborhood and community. There has been churches and organizations that have been there for a long time who we need to acknowledge their presence and not just come in and import our own presence into that community. And so, underlying all of this, I would say, is just a reminder, this goes also back, everything goes back to what Wayne says. So, just get used to that today. When we're trying to work with broken people, it's often the case that we come to discover they're living in a broken system. And sometimes it's the case we can work with broken people for hours and weeks and months and years, but until we address the systemic issues in which they're living, we're probably not going to see long-term transformation in that neighborhood, their community, or maybe even their life. And so some of the things that we can do even in this room, a faithful response might be getting onto a commission, getting onto a board, volunteering in a particular way that can bring systemic change to that community that will ultimately change not just the life of one individual, but perhaps the lives of generations. So that's how I would encourage us to think about faithful response.
Thanks, Andy. It's interesting how these remarks are dovetailing. So with the IPC Foundation, we are a grant-making foundation. We've been at it for about 25 years. But by and large, the grants that we make are what I would call reactive in nature. That is, the grantees that we work with conceive and operate their programs, package those into grant applications that come to us. And our main involvement with those programs is to try to understand them so that we can make a wise allocation of our limited grant dollars. But in 2010, the foundation encountered a situation where that model doesn't work. We had become very concerned about the problem of summer learning loss in low-income students, and very excited about a program that we worked with the Fresh Air Farm. And we wanted to fund more programs, but there weren't any. So we had to become proactive. We began approaching community-based and faith-based organizations, even school systems, to encourage them to insert a rigorous academic component to their existing summer programming. We began to approach other funders to convince them to join us in supporting these programs. And we've been pretty successful. This summer, we had a group of 10 funders come together and allocate about $700,000 to support 30 programs here in Birmingham. So we've been making progress. We've had to go beyond that because many of the programs that we work with really didn't have an educator on staff. And running a high-quality school takes professionals, so we've developed resources so that these organizations have access to groups that they can bring in to conduct the school programming for them. And we've also put in a standard measurement system so we can tell where we're being successful, where we're not, and make the necessary adjustments. This model is sometimes referred to as collective impact. So I think as we look at a faithful response going forward, the collective impact model is going to be something that we use more and more to solve these really messy, complicated problems like poverty. One more quick comment. We touched on advocacy, and last week we had a great presentation from Bread for the World. They talk about the way they do advocacy, which is basically influencing public policy. And that's essential. I certainly support it. But I would submit to you that what we've done with our summer learning work here is another form of advocacy. I like to think of it as a Tom Sawyer school of advocacy. You just start whitewashing that fence and you invite other people to join you. And I can tell you that it really works. So another comment on faithful response is let's just go out and start doing something that needs to be done and invite others to join us in the work.
I'm Angie, Wright, and I'm speaking today on behalf of Greater Birmingham Ministries. I want to say I'm very grateful for the reactive funding that the foundation does, because we've gotten a great deal of support from the foundation for our work. I want to just look at a glimpse in the life of Jesus from the Gospel of Luke to begin with, because it gives a glimpse into the way that GBM does our work. And one day, the children came to Jesus. The disciples rebuked them and silenced them. And Jesus said, if you can't come to him like a child with your needs, without any expectation of something in return, then you can't reach the kingdom of God. And that's the very definition of grace. Next, he encounters the rich young ruler, where, of course, we know he told him that he had to give away all that he had and distribute it to the poor. Not a loan to the poor, not figuring out who is the deserving poor, no strings attached, not coming up with some obstacles that they have to surmount in order to receive that distribution, but that the rich young ruler's salvation was bound up and given freely to the poor. Then Jesus came across the blind Bartimaeus, who cried out for mercy. He, like the children, was rebuked, told to be silent. And Jesus asked him, what do you need? And he said, I need my sight. And Jesus freely gave it to him. Then Jesus meets up with Zacchaeus. And we know he was the chief tax collector. And that was the system, as has been mentioned. A system that was regressive and abusive and corrupt and kept people poor. And Zacchaeus promised and said that he gave half of his goods to the poor, and if he had defrauded anyone, he would restore that 4 times over. That was a system of reparations that he was putting into place for the damage that had been caused. Then, same day, Jesus goes into the temple and drives out the money changers. Another system of predatory practices against the poor that kept the poor poor. A regressive tax system, essentially, that was kept in place by the religious authorities. Then we come to the moment where Jesus says, beware of the scribes who have these beautiful religious practices but devour the houses of widows. A predatory practice that keeps people in perpetual debt. All of this in a day's work for Jesus. In that one day, he responds to the immediate needs of the most vulnerable people without condition. That's what we do at GBM. When we provide food, clothing, emergency assistance, 2/3 of our clients, nearly 2/3, are elderly and disabled and unable to hold traditional jobs. And in fact, are forbidden to do that by law because of the disability and SSI checks that they receive. We see Jesus restore people to community, people that have been deemed unclean by virtue of their afflictions, people who've been cast out of their communities. And we see that at GBM. And so we not only give a bag of groceries or clothing to people, but we listen to the stories of our clients, and we build relationships with them, and we help them restore relationships and rebuild the the fabric of their communities. We see Jesus teaching the crowds with parables that empower them to analyze what's going on in their world, analyze the oppressive forces in their lives, and imagine that an alternative existence is possible and that, in fact, they are deserving of another kind of life, that they are deserving of life and life abundant. We do the same thing. Now, we don't usually teach in parables. We would if we knew how. But we do teach our clients all kinds of things about issues affecting them and their communities. And we go deeper with many of our clients and do leadership development to help them come together and find ways to improve the lives of their own families and the lives of their communities. On this one day, we see Jesus calling on people who have resources to give to the poor and the defenseless without condition, and also to challenge the systems that undermine their humanity and their ability to survive and to thrive. And GBM does the same. We call on our supporting faith communities like yours to do the same. And we see it on this one day, Jesus challenging and overturning the systems of taxation and debt and political and social and religious oppression that keep people poor and keep people downtrodden. And we do the same. To say that feeding the hungry creates dependency is like saying that to have a homeless shelter creates homelessness. And we have certainly heard that mentality. At GBM, we found that people are hungry because they don't have food. They don't have food because they don't have enough money. Many of them don't have enough money because they're elderly and disabled, as I said, and their checks are less than $700 a month. And their food stamps are often, for an individual, $12 a month. Or a couple, they're $45 a month. And that's not enough to make it through. Many don't have enough money. Many of the poor work. Many of the poor work 2 jobs, but they're minimum wage jobs, and it's just not enough to get by. Many of the people we're seeing work, but are not getting paid for their work. They're undocumented, or they're homeless, they're working in a cash economy, and they are sometimes not getting paid for some or all of the work that they do. And we've started a program to help people combat wage theft because of that. Many don't have enough money because even though they had a job, it took one medical emergency to drive them into poverty. Some don't have, many don't have enough money because the bus ran late too many times or didn't show up at all. This last Thursday we had a meeting and we heard 5 people talking about how the bus ran late, the bus didn't show up, and they decided to walk, and they got there before the bus did. And they lost their jobs because they couldn't get to work. Many don't have money because they borrowed money from the only place they could get it, which was payday lenders. They borrowed money to fix their car or to pay their medical bills, and now they're caught up in a stranglehold of debt. Some don't have money. I know you've heard this from Foster Cook. Some don't have money because they're on probation or parole. They pay their debt to society from a crime they've committed, often a nonviolent drug offense. And every time they go out to get a job, they fill out an application and they have to stare at that question on that job application that says, have you ever been convicted? And some of them say, have you ever been arrested? Not even convicted. And they have to decide whether to check that box or whether to lie. And either way, they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. And Foster will tell you they cannot afford to pay the ever-escalating fees and fines. And they get caught in a stranglehold of debt. There are these systems that keep people poor. Jesus knew it. We know it at GBM, and the people we help know it. And it can cause hopelessness, and it can cause paralysis. What people may not know is that there is hope, and that when people come together, that change is possible. Change is possible, that it is possible for us to have a reliable public transportation system in Birmingham, that it is possible to have a primary health care system without a 75-day wait. And Roger's going to fix that, right? That it is possible for people to get loans without it being predatory lending. That we can make changes in the criminal justice system that keep people, that let people have a chance. That there is a place in the economy for people, and that people should be paid for their work. All these things are possible if we all come together. But in the meantime, that we'll do all we can to make sure that they don't go to bed hungry tonight. And that they don't lose custody of their children because they failed to pay their utilities. And that they won't be rebuked or silenced for lifting up their voices about the injustice of it all. That's how we do our work at GBM. That's our faithful response. Thank you.
Okay, in response to the question, or answering the question, what the faith community's response can be, I think there are three responses. One is awareness, one is engagement, and the other is action. To begin with, we need to continue this conversation. This series has been inspiring, it's been informative, but it can't end here. The issues of poverty and hunger are enormously complex, as you've heard just sitting at this table and in our prior conversations. So the more we know about hunger and poverty, the better equipped we are then to address the issues. So I think people of faith have to be knowledgeable. We know that poverty and hunger has a devastating impact on educational achievement and on psychosocial outcomes and on health outcomes. We know the negative consequences that malnutrition and low birth weight has on children's lifelong ability to learn. We know the negative consequences that living in poverty have on children's behavioral and emotional development and health. Consequences like impulsiveness and inappropriate aggressiveness and inability to socialize with peers appropriately, feelings of inferiority and shame and anyway, we know that those have an impact on children, and that goes with children their entire low self-esteem. That's right. Those go with children their entire lives. So, just by way of example, before we decide that cutting assistance to the Women, Infants, and Children's program is a good strategy for balancing the budget, we really need to understand the consequences, the very real consequences of any action that we take. Otherwise, our children really just become collateral damage in our nation's war on the deficit and as society takes these broad brush strokes at stereotyping poor. Sort of second to Brian Vickert's point, we need to be in relationship. And the reality is that poverty and hunger really don't intersect in our lives very much, if at all. So we really need to be in community with people whose life circumstances are very different from our own. We need to be sitting at the table with the poor, talking to the poor, not about the poor or at the poor. And I have a feeling that if a poor person was sitting at this table, their perspective on what we have to say today may be very, very different, and we need to be listening to those perspectives. we need to be sharing our stories. Sharing stories is powerfully transformative. When we share our stories with each other, we're changed, and that change may be in such subtle ways that we don't even know it. And then we need to act. As people of faith, we need to advocate for public policy that addresses the root causes and effects of hunger and poverty, and against those that exacerbate the problem. We have structures and systems in this country that, or in this country and this state, that really make it very difficult for people to move beyond their own current circumstances. And just one point that Dr. Flynt brought up early was Alabama's tax structure. And make no mistake about it, every one of us in this room, sitting here collectively, is responsible for the most progressive tax system in the United States. And that's because we have allowed it to happen. It's because we haven't used our collective voice to speak out against it. So we are complicit in the fact that we have something that is immoral and it's unacceptable, and it's really something that the faith community could do something about if we did raise our collective voices throughout Alabama. So I just close my remarks with a quote from Martin Luther King, who says, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends."
We have questions from the audience. Get this discussion going.
Okay.
All right, go.
I have this fantasy in this congregation, everybody in this room, everybody in the church, you get on buses and go to the government and camp out until they did something we really wanted them to do. Now, my question is, would you all suggest that the first thing, I have my idea, but would you suggest that the first thing is to call a constitutional convention and get everything fixed so that power is not all in Montgomery? Or would you suggest that we make a finally take the state tax off of groceries and medicine? Which do you think should come first?
Panelists? Wayne?
I'm a contrarian. I really think Alabama Rise does such a good job of lobbying that this is a great example of what I mean by wasting time by ignoring networks. Alabama Rise will organize a big rally, and they'll network with community ministries and anybody who wants to be a part of that network. And I assume this church probably supports Alabama Rise. Our church has it in our budget. So when they give you a chance to go down there, go down there. But Constitutional Convention and Home Rule is not a politically realistic strategy to waste your time. Because when the 1901 Constitution devolved power from individual counties and individual citizens and centralized it in the state legislature, you now have 140 state legislators who are your county commission. You're just wasting your time having a county commission meeting because they don't have real power. Your legislative delegations blocks, they don't want the county commission to do. Therefore, to ask the people who have the power, who were given the power in 1901, to now voluntarily give it up, you won't even find black representatives from the black belt who will support that. However, you will be surprised at what a broad coalition you can build around the idea of doing away with the sales tax on groceries, including, I might add, a fundamentalist Baptist church in Auburn, where many of the members have actually gone to the Alabama Baptist Convention and voted in favor of that reform. So what we have to do as a political strategy is winnow out what's workable, because we can build a realistic coalition around it. versus what is not realistic, like spending lots of time and energy on trying to get a statewide convention. Best thing to do is let the Alabama State Constitution finally break down, which it will, because it's so anti-modern. And when it breaks down, it'll break down so fundamentally, probably during some economic national crisis, that we won't have to argue about it anymore. This is what happened in California, and they rewrote their Constitution a couple of years ago. And it will happen in Alabama. So go after the low-hanging fruit. Don't go after the fruit that is most idealistically what you want to do, but is not doable within the current political culture.
Linda, you're hitting on an interesting point, though, even taking the tax off groceries, which we would think would be the low-hanging fruit, but we're the only two states in the United States that tax groceries, tax on groceries. That's been tried. And Alabama Rise has tried and tried and tried to get that through the Alabama legislature. But when you do something like that, somebody has to pay for that. I mean, there's a cost to taking the tax off the groceries. And while tax is certainly, sales tax is certainly regressive, it's everybody sitting in this room who's going to pay more in taxes because we do that, because the state income tax that we take off as a deduction, and you probably would lose that. So that's what you run into. So you have voices who are out there saying, oh no, we can't do this, this is going to cost us money. They need to be hearing from our voices that say yes and that's okay. So, and they're not hearing that.
That's what I mean. Every other state in the Union seems to have been able to do it. And even the constitutional amendment, everybody else has managed to reform. But even if we could elect people to the Jefferson County delegation who would go down there and vote for a constitutional convention, there's got to be a way to do it. I've heard Flynt, of course. I've heard it for 35 years. It's not going to happen. So I guess what I'm saying is, if churches en masse could go down there and just sit, scream until it's done, I'm sure we're going to have kind of.
All right, let's put that on board to the barricades. Is option one. We'll vote on that later.
If I can just, say one other thing about that, I think it's, not good to get into an either-or kind of conversation, but some of these that's a very long-term change, and you have to do the long-term groundwork for it. And so it may not be that the legislature's going to do it right now, but we need to be out talking, educating, organizing. You never know when that tide, something might happen that tide will change overnight. Nobody thought that apartheid would fall, overnight, or the Berlin Wall would fall overnight, but people had worked on it for decades. And then suddenly the time was right, the tipping point, if you will. And so we have to do that grassroots work in the not only at the Independent Presbyterian, but what about all the other Presbyterian churches? What about in your neighborhoods, in your communities? People don't know why we would even need a constitutional convention. They don't even know what's wrong with the Constitution. That's the work that's got to be done. And so that when the time is right, it can change. And the tax system is just one part of it. So what about working toward a change in the tax system? That's a huge bite out of it. Of course, the sales tax on groceries is a small bite out of that.
All right. Who else wants to go? Felix, you sure you're a usual suspect?
I wonder why we define poverty in terms of what we don't have, rather than overcoming and defining what we do have. I had no power bills when I grew up. I had no grocery bills when I grew up, but we didn't have electricity until almost 9/10. But I had a wonderful market. I had no idea that I lived in poverty. In my working years, I found just as much poverty among those who have a lot as I did with those who, in terms of our definition of what could happen. So why do we determine poverty just for those persons in terms of the materialistic side, rather than look at the spiritual side of what we all got to offer each other and to lift each other up and appreciate what each person has and put that in the pot and stir it and do the division from that point of view rather than this, that, that.
Andy, what are some of the most effective things you see going on?
No, that point was brought home to me. I was back in February in the country of Rwanda in a small village, and I stuck out in a small village in Rwanda. A young boy came up to me to practice his English. He was probably 8 years old. And I was trying to think of things to engage in the conversation. So I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? He said, I want to be a pilot. Now, he's living in a village where they have no electricity and no running water to the houses. But he has dreams about his future. He's never been to an airport, never been on an airplane, but he sees things going overhead that have given him dreams about his future. Now, I thought to myself, to that point, he doesn't have electricity or water in his neighborhood, but he also doesn't have skyrocketing rates of depression. You know, he doesn't have a neighborhood in which you have everything, and yet people still trying to find something to latch onto to give meaning to their lives. So you're right. I mean, there is a real sense in which we have we're trying to grab onto as much material stuff as we can, hoping that something somewhere along the way will find meaning, that our lives will finally matter. And it leads to its own sort of hopelessness and poverty and brokenness. And yet you go into villages and communities, neighborhoods, that have nothing material, but they have happy children who are smiling and kicking the soccer balls, not knowing anything different, that their world is visibly broken to us. You know, at the end of the day, we're all broken. It's just a matter of how visible it is to the outside world. I walked in that village in Rwanda, it looked very broken to me visibly. But as I got to know the people there, they had their lives in some senses more together than perhaps my neighbors here in America. So you got to get down to worldview issues on those levels.
I was a member of one of these groups trying to change the Alabama Constitution, and I heard someone say, "We're not going to make any progress with some of these people who now down the legislation got off." She wouldn't have any prayer meetings.
No. Well, I think one thing that y'all have brought up that I think should be pointed out, this is a little bit like the whitewashing fence analogy that you made, Jim. Mike Flynn would say, if you start a good enough parade, the politicians will notice that there's a good parade going on, and they'll get in front of it, and they'll lead it. Or they'll look behind you and say, where are we going? like they'll get the attention. And so I think a lot of the positive things that have happened in Birmingham in the last several years have been the result of grassroots activism and local people joining together, and the politicians eventually catch on and say, hey, that's a pretty good thing. People are interested in that. And so I think, to your point, the more we get involved in the networks that are existing and fill them up, we're going to make progress. But we're fighting against a payday loan issue that Alabama Rise has championed for years and years. And you know, we have all that. We actually consciously take more money from people from poverty through payday lending, through the tax system, through the court system. And if we could change the conversation to say, poverty is bad for them, but it's bad for us too, like Wayne was suggesting, getting in the rhetoric of self-interest to a certain extent, maybe start changing some minds and realizing that, you know, low wage, we're not going to have a great economy with low-wage jobs anymore. They can find that in Africa and Asia. So I think the changing the conversation a little bit would be helpful. Yes?
Can I make a plea for personal charitable giving as opposed to taxpayers? The reason I mention this, tax money is money taken by force. Therefore, it's a form of dirty money. And if we can take our own personal money and put it into areas that are helping and not depend too much on taking money from someone else by force and using it to do our good. In other words, put our own money into our personal charities.
Response?
I'm not sure that I particularly agree with you on that point. I think it goes to capacity. I know there's a big, there's a lot of people who believe that government shouldn't be involved in these programs. They shouldn't be involved in health care and those things. But you have to look at three things. You have to look at the magnitude of the need. You have to look at the efficiency with which that need can be met, and then you have to look at capacity. So I was mentioned one statistic that's I've read for the world statistic, and for every bag of groceries that soup kitchens or food pantries in the United States provide, the government provides 24. So government is really the only entity that has the capacity to deal with the magnitude of the issue. And that's why I think when we start changing to let's do it ourselves, it's the church's responsibility to take care of the poor, and those kinds of conversations, we forget that nobody has the capacity to deal with these issues better than the government. May not be the most efficient, but the capacity, I think, is the thing to cover.
And we know that your point of view is a valid one and is held by many. And we may not all agree on it, but there are things we can work on together in the relationship. The government is at a certain level and it provides a certain level of assistance and help, but those catalytic programs like STARE, like SAIL, where you're working one-on-one, you're building relationships with people, I think we're really called to do that urgently, and we don't do it enough, frankly. So thank y'all so much for having us. We're going to be late for church. The panel will stay and hang out and talk and interact. Wayne Flynt's books are here and available. Thank y'all so much for coming, and let's keep this conversation going.